I came up with my lesson title too late to get it published and everything, but it is entitled Before the Cock Crows. Have you ever been paralyzed by fear? My guess is that each of you can know exactly a situation or a time when you were afraid for your life, or scared about something seen or unseen, or afraid because of something you had done. My guess it's kind of flipping through the file cabinet in your mind right now. Maybe during that moment of fear, your hands felt sweaty, your heart started to beat, you wanted to turn and run. You may have screamed out in fear or lied so that you could get out of a given situation. I'll never forget the first time I began to really understand what fear was. I was probably about 5 or 6 years old, and my parents and I had gone to Santa Cruz for an extended weekend of fun. There was this huge indoor arcade that was filled with games and things to do inside, but the one thing that my brother and I absolutely loved was the 2-story wooden slide. And we'd climb up those 2 stories, and then we'd sit on a gunny sack and we'd push ourselves off and we'd slide down as fast as we could. And whee! It was so wonderful. Now, my dad didn't have much of a fear, and he rode it with us on several occasions, but my mother was another story. She sat on the benches at the bottom of the stairs and would watch us go up and down and up and down. And so finally, my brother and I kept begging her, "Come on, Mom, come on, come on. Let's do the slide, let's do the slide." And she'd just say, "No, no." And finally, my brother and I began to nag her. We weren't going to let this go. We were going to make her ride that slide. And she would still continue to say no. Well, we probably nagged one too many times, and finally she grabbed one of our gunny sacks and took off and walked up the 2 stories worth of stairs, put the gunny sack down, and sat on it and pushed off. Well, she made it about 1/4 of the way down the slide. And then there were 2x4 railings that were highly polished so that we didn't overlap our lane. And she grabbed those and stopped, and you could see the fear on her face. And I've never, ever seen my father run or move as fast as he did as he tore up 2 stories and kept talking to her all the way up as he eased his way down to her and then wrapped his legs around her and slowly moved her back down to the bottom of the slide. My dad wasn't too happy with Ken and I. In fact, he proceeded to give us a little bit of lecture about fear and how our mother was afraid of roller coasters and slides and things that went fast, that she couldn't deal with that. That was my first recognition about fear. About 2,000 years ago, there was a man who experienced great fear. His name was Simon Peter. Simon Peter was the first man that Jesus called to be one of his 12 disciples. Initially, his name was Simon, but Jesus gave him the name of Peter, or Cephas in Greek. According to the Metaphysical Bible Dictionary, Simon means hearing. Peter meant having a special ability to discern truth. It signified he was receptive to new ideas and had a spiritually receptive mind. Metaphysical Peter means strong, firm, unyielding, as well as rock. The name Peter also represents faith in God, enduring and unwavering. Now, when Jesus first met Simon, we know he was a fisherman. He lived in a town called Capernaum, which is at the north end of the Sea of Galilee, where he fished with his brother Andrew and James and John Zebedee, who ultimately would also be called by Jesus to be part of the 12 disciples. He and his brother took over the fishing business from his father. Now, we know he was married by passages in the Bible, but we have absolutely no idea if he ever had children. His wife traveled with Peter for the 3 years that they followed Jesus, and Andrew was the one, his brother, who introduced Simon to Jesus. Because you see, Andrew had heard John the Baptist proclaim that Jesus was the Lamb of God. So we know through conversations in the Bible that Peter was an extremely complex individual. He was probably uneducated, even though ultimately there are 2 books, 1st and 2nd Peter, that are credited to him, but what our guess is more than likely scribes wrote them for him and put his name on them. We also know that he had a terrible temper and he was a hothead. He was impulsive, outspoken, enthusiastic, strong-willed, and at times he could be real brass. Frankly, the description of him reminds me of a modern-day bully. Peter was part of the inner circle of Jesus' disciples, along with James and John. Even though Peter was the confidant of Jesus and was directed to begin a church built on the teachings of Jesus, he was also a human being. He confronted Jesus for predicting his own death, and in turn, Jesus rebuked him profusely. And in the Garden of Gethsemane, the night before Jesus was to die on the cross, even though Jesus had instructed him and the other disciples that were there to stay awake and keep watch because Jesus knew what was coming, they all fell asleep. And when Jesus showed up, or when Judas showed up with the Roman soldiers and he arrived to arrest Jesus, Peter attacked the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear with a sword. And Jesus said none of that. He grabbed the ear, put it back on, and healed it instantly. The only person who is mentioned almost as much as Jesus in the 4 Gospels is Peter. So you can understand that this dude, this guy called Peter, was a pretty important person at the beginning of Christianity. And even though he vowed only hours before the arrest of Jesus to be loyal, Peter denied him 3 times before the cock crowed. Why, we might ask? After all, Jesus wasn't dead yet. The answer is simple and yet complex. Fear. We know that Peter was fearful a couple of times that are related in the Bible. The first one was when Jesus was walking during a storm towards the boat in the Sea of Galilee, and he was walking on top of the water, and Peter thought, well, he can do it, I can do it too. And he jumped out of the boat and started to walk, and all of a sudden, he lost his faith, and fear took over, and he began to sink. And Jesus stepped in and saved him. Peter was approached 3 times the night before Jesus was crucified. All 3 times he denied that he knew Jesus or that he was one of his followers. Fear can make us forget all that we know, including truth, trust, and courage. Dr. Ernest Holmes, our founder, tells us there is no fear in love and there is no liberation from fear without love. Fear is based on the supposition that we are unprotected, rejected, and friendless. If the fearful mind would entertain love and the harmony and the peace that go with it, it must turn from everything that denies this love and, trusting in divine guidance, open its being to the influx of love not just love of God, but love of everything, for love is all inclusive. Dr. Wayne Dyer stated, "Be patient and loving with every fearful thought. Fear and love are unable to reside simultaneously within you. If you are afraid, you have cast out love. If you are experiencing perfect love, which is within your free will, then you have cast out fear." Webster's dictionary tells us that fear is an unpleasant, often strong emotion caused by anticipation or awareness of danger. That would pretty much sum up what Simon Peter experienced. He was fearful that he too would be arrested by the Roman soldiers at the request of the chief priests, scribes, and elders. Peter wasn't sure what happened to Jesus, but he had a pretty good idea based on how Jesus had predicted his death. And Peter knew it would not be good. If he owned up to the truth of who he was afraid that that same thing might happen to him. Fears shrink us. They prevent us from being who God has created us to be. It inhibits us from the truth of who we really are. Psychologists tell us that fear is one of the 7 universal emotions experienced by everyone around the world. Fear arises with the threat of harm, either physical, emotional, psychological, or real or imaginated. While traditionally considered a negative emotion, fear actually serves an important role in keeping us safe and mobilizing us to cope with potential danger. The family of fearless experiences or fearful experiences can be distinguished in the terms of intensity, timing, and coping. Intensity means how severe is the harm that is threatened. Timing means that is the harm immediate or impending. And coping means what, if any, question can be taken to reduce or eliminate the threat we are facing. As I look back on my mother on the slide, I now have a greater understanding of the fear that she was experiencing. She felt she was in harm's way. It wasn't pending, it was a happening thing. The only way she knew how to cope was to grab the railing and stop and get off that slide as fast as she could. It was similar for Simon Peter. Each time he was asked, "Aren't you part of that group of followers?" he felt he was in harm's way. For him, potential harm wasn't pending. It would happen if he owned up to his identity. And the only way that he knew to cope with that was to lie. If you reflect upon the fear you remember at the beginning of the lesson, or the one that you focused on while we were meditating, you probably have a greater understanding of what was transpiring within you. And certainly we can understand the intensity of Peter's fear that his life would be short-lived and that he was not equipped in those moments to deal with that fear that was gripping him. Fear does have an important role in our life, however. It isn't all bad. The universal function of fear is to avoid or reduce harm. The immediate threat of harm focuses our attention on mobilizing us to cope with the situation or to cope with danger. In this way, fear can actually save our lives by forcing us to react without having to think about it. It's like jumping out of the way of a speeding car that's coming right at you. We all have the preset reactions to fear known as fight, flight, or freeze. Those reactions have been with us since the beginning of mankind. It's in our DNA as much as our skin color, our height, or our body type. There are also steps we can take to help cope with fear. The strategies focus on managing the physical, the emotional, and behavioral aspects or effects of fear. The first practice is mindfulness. While you cannot always prevent certain emotions, being mindful can help you manage them. Replace negative thoughts with more helpful ones. Next, get social support. Having supportive people in your life can help you manage your feelings of fear. You can also use stress management techniques. That includes deep breathing, relaxing muscles, and visualization. Don't forget to take care of your health also. That means eating well, exercising, and getting a good night's sleep. These are all things that we as religious scientists already know or practice. However, I'm sure Peter, when approached by a female servant and asked if he was one of Jesus' followers, he wasn't going through a checklist of healthy habits. He did, however, need to rise above his insecurities and once again discover the truth of who he was. And just who was that? He was the rock on which a new religion would be created. Fear can bring us closer to God. When we survive something that has heightened our fear, we trust God to a greater degree. That process, as Ram Dass puts it, teaches us to love whatever brings us into a greater relationship with the divine. Peter found himself in a position that he did not choose. Have any of you been placed in that position? Life placed a demand on you that you weren't ready to deal with. Sometimes you end up in a place of kicking and screaming and fighting, not wanting to go and protesting. I don't want to be here. I don't want to do this. And yet there is grace in that journey. A grace that gives us freedom. It is that place of unconditional love given without any strings attached. It transforms us by the power of faith, a faith that always nudges us, that keeps pressing us to release our fear. Fear also brings us to a place of discovering and knowing and owning our courage. Eleanor Roosevelt stated, "You gain strength, courage, and confidence by every experience in which you really stop to look fear in the face." The word courage is related or comes from the Latin word cure, C-U-E-R, which means heart. Our fears forces our heart to find an inner courage that may cause us to suffer or meet other challenges. And yet we grow. We grow by facing our fears and taking action. We face our fears when we speak our truth and question the unknown. We face our fears with courage when we willingly listen to others. We face our fears with courage when we think for ourselves and then accept our own responsibility for the choices that we have made. We face our fears when we open our heart to love the unknown that has shown up in our life. Peter would ultimately face his fears and live to tell a new story of love. In 1 John 4:18, it states, "There is no fear in love, but perfect love drives out all fear." When we let go of our fears, we soften our hearts. We become more whole, more secure in who we are and what we can do. We discover an ordinary courage that enables us to take action. In February of 1987, Ralph Flanders, who was an insurance executive, had hired a private pilot to take him to a meeting. He was the only passenger in the small Cessna. About a half an hour into the flight, the pilot stopped talking and he slumped over in his seat. He had had a heart attack. He was dead. Flanders, who was from Wisconsin, made his way up to the cockpit, grabbed the controls, and sat down and said to himself, "You better learn how to fly this thing right now." He picked up the radio on the microphone and started to yell, "Mayday, mayday, help, help. The pilot is dead and I don't know how to fly a plane." Mike Feltz was a flight instructor who happened to be up in the air and was about 50 miles away. He began to fly towards Flanders' location, and Feltz coached him over the radio continuously. He kept telling him what to do, trying to keep him calm. Ralph flew that plane for about an hour and a half, and ultimately he said it seemed like it was a million years. Eventually, they made it back to the airfield at Tomah, Wisconsin. The Cessna circled the airfield about 5 or 6 times. The first time he tried to land it, it hit the ground and bounced back up, and he was flying again. The next time he came around, he cut off the throttle and managed to land the plane safely on the edge of the runway. He emerged from the plane uninjured, but certainly shaken. Mike Feltz had managed to coach Ralph to safety. I can't even imagine the fear that Ralph must have experienced in that hour or an hour and a half that he was flying a plane that he knew nothing about, or the feelings that Mike must have felt having the total responsibility for the life of a person that depended on him. To me, this story represents the power of surrender and letting God in. We can't all do it by ourselves. Sometimes we have to let the power of grace and the divine take charge. We have to trust the Christ consciousness that is the presence within us when fear surrounds us. Chapter 22 in the Science of Mind text is entitled Finding the Christ. I'd like to close with a couple of passages that are so appropriate for today's lessons, as well as for the celebration of Easter. Holmes writes, "We must look afar to see the Christ, for he is ever near at hand. Thou art the center and the circumstances of my life, the beginningless and the endless part of me, the eternal reality of me, the eternal good working through me, the infinite love impelling me, the limitless peace and calm within me, the perfect life living through and in me, the joy of the soul and the light of the Spirit illuminating me. O Lord God, eternal and forever blessed, thou part my whole be." Christ places his hand in the outstretched hand of the universe and walks unafraid through life. Through the long night watches, his hand clasps mine. At the break of dawn, his hand clasps mine. In the daylight of work and endeavor, from eternity to eternity, his hand clasps mine. When time shall have passed, when eternity shall be strewn about like falling petals, and space and worlds shall be swallowed up in everlasting blessedness, his hand will clasp mine. Knowing, as Holmes has written, that whatever fear arises within each and every one of us, the hand of Christ is clasping ours, and love flows in. This is the truth in my life, and this is the truth in yours, and so it is. Amen.